Welcome back, folks. Free Money Podcast, episode 5. In this episode, we will look more closely at the topic of deflation. This is a topic that most Bitcoiners ignore completely, or they get their analysis completely wrong. I have not really met any Bitcoiner that has got a correct view on deflation, and we will examine the reasons why as we get into the topic. What we see on screen here is a quote from Irving Fisher, a famous American economist who wrote quite a bit around monetary theory, and we will look at some of his work in this episode, and we will tie it back to some of the very important comments from Friedrich Hayek that we covered in episode 3. But let's go ahead and read what Irving Fisher had to say around the purchasing power of money in a deflationary environment. From his 1933 book here, as you can see, Debt Deflation Theory of Great Depression. So this, of course, would have been after 1929 major stock market crash and severe depression in the US, Great Depression. And the whole thing was a result of overextension of bank credit. Because at the time, the US was on a gold standard. Even the Federal Reserve was on a gold standard. It, by law, could only create dollars. It had to have 40% gold backing for the dollar supply. So, yeah, the overextension of bank credit had led to a boom in the economy, massive stock market prices, and then when nerves kicked in, and folks sought to withdraw gold from the system, that was risky, because if a bank went under back then, that was it, you had lost your money. So folks took their money, which was gold, out of the system. And that led to Franklin D. Roosevelt issuing Executive Order 6102, hand in your gold, basically. And I'm sure we'll come back and we'll look at that Executive Order in a little bit more detail in a later episode. But that was what happened in between 1929 to 1933, a period of depression in America, which led to Irving Fisher having this to say about it. The fall in prices, that is the rise in the purchasing power of money, reduces the velocity of circulation, and I have highlighted that because we will come back to that and look at that in a variety of contexts, including a famous, I'll call it quasi-mathematical equation that Irving Fisher produced. He goes on to say, this increases the holder's motive to hoard. So that is the purchasing power, a rise in the purchasing power of money increases the holder's motivation to hoard. And that makes perfect sense for anybody that understands human behaviour. You know, if your money's going to buy you more tomorrow, you're not going to spend it today. You're going to hold off and say, hey, I can get the same thing for cheaper tomorrow. So, I mean, this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, this type of economic analysis. Anyone that kind of can think about things logically will realise that this is true. A rise in the purchasing power of money increases the holder's motive to hoard. And it's amazing that the Bitcoiners say that this is not the case. They think in a deflationary environment, no, I'm still going to spend my Bitcoin. And we'll see how false that statement is, really, whenever we have a look in a later slide here at an example of a deflationary spiral, and that includes massive unemployment, of course. So, you know, maybe this argument that Bitcoiners make that they will still spend their Bitcoin even in a deflation or hyperdeflationary environment, that's not going to be true for 99% of people. Maybe the very, very elite who don't really care about income, they might spend. But, you know, if you're unemployed and you've got some scarce money, you're not going to run out and spend that on discretionary products. But let's continue on with the statement from Fisher. He says that this leads to a fall in the volume of goods purchased. Okay, less spending in the economy, and this is on aggregate, of course, and that's just the point I tried to make previously there around, Bitcoiners saying that they would still go out and spend. Well, on aggregate, the spending will reduce, and that leads to a fall in the velocity of circulation and the volume of goods purchased, in using Fisher's words. For a given quantity of money, this entails a fall in the nominal value of transactions. The velocity falls, the volume of goods purchases falls, the value of transactions falls. The resulting fall in aggregate demand in turn strengthens the deflation. So what he's describing here is a deflationary feedback loop, which can be quite a challenge to escape from. This slide is just a Google search Gemini AI analysis of that statement from Irving Fisher, and I'll not read out the whole thing, but I'll read out some of it because it is really important to understand how serious a matter deflation is if it's allowed to take hold. So Gemini AI says that the passage that we just looked at describes a negative feedback loop related to deflation and the velocity of money. Falling prices or increased purchasing power can lead to individuals to hoard instead of spend. What's critical about this analysis is the feedback loop, because that requires some type of intervention to stop it. Otherwise, real problems appear on the production side, and this is something that the Bitcoiners fail to see. I have never actually had any Bitcoiner, and I've had arguments with many hundreds over the years on Twitter and X, and not one of them have recognised that there is an impact on production, which is bizarre to me that they can't see it, because the evidence is very, very clear for anyone that looks at deflation, that it seeps into prices and production. And production essentially collapses if there's a money that is hoarded in extremis. I would describe that as a hyperdeflationary collapse. Bitcoiners don't recognise that. They seem to think that if Bitcoin was money and products were priced in Bitcoin, taxes were to be paid in Bitcoin, employment contracts were to be paid in Bitcoin, that everything would go along as normal as it does for them today, where they hold Bitcoin as a token representing a digital ledger entry that exists in a fiat world where production and wages and taxes are paid in fiat currency, and Bitcoin as a token exists in a fiat currency money system. Now, if you were to strip away that fiat system, let's say governments threw in the towel and said, "You're right, guys, fiat currency's rubbish, it's not fair, it's an unfair money system, and we'll just go to use Bitcoin now. To pay your taxes in Bitcoin, all contracts must be denominated in Bitcoin, including wages." Bitcoiners fail to see that type of a fixed limit money and this type of real world application, i.e. the real way that money works in the real world, would cause a complete collapse. It would be like Mad Max. No producer is going to take the risk of employment contracts being denominated in Bitcoin in an environment of ever falling prices. Let's have a closer look at how Fisher described this at a high level in Fisher's equation of exchange. So what we have on screen now, a very famous equation in economics, and what I would say before we look into the details of it, if you're a Bitcoiner and you've never heard of this equation of exchange, and there's no reason that you would have unless you studied economics, because no Bitcoin material refers to this equation of exchange, because Bitcoiners just don't want to they don't want to recognise that there is a problem with deflation with a fixed limit money, a significant problem with deflation in a fixed limit money that will become apparent as we look at this equation. But If you're a Bitcoiner, have never heard of this equation of exchange, and you are running about telling other people to study Bitcoin, which most of them do. If you say anything negative about Bitcoin, their first retort is, "Oh, you don't understand it, you haven't studied it." When in fact, it's Bitcoiners who say these things that haven't studied money. So they claim that Bitcoin is money, but they don't know the first thing about money, other than the very, very limited understanding of you buy stuff with it. So let's look at the detail of this equation of exchange and see what it means. So MV equals PQ. The total value of goods and services exchanged in an economy, which is the PQ side, is equal to the money supply multiplied by the velocity of money, and that is the MV side. So M represents the money supply, V is the velocity, P is the average price level, Q is the quantity of goods and services, and I'll just refer to that as production. So if M is fixed, it can't be adjusted at all, then the equation becomes V equals PQ. So we're removing the money supply aspect. That prices and production are dependent on a velocity. And if velocity drops, as we know it will, then PQ will also begin to fall, and that is the beginning of the deflationary spiral. And we can see one of many visual examples of a deflationary spiral. You can search for this yourself online and you'll find a number of different diagrams. I'm using this one because it's a simpler aspect of it, and the key here is just to show how all of these factors in the economy link together. If prices start to fall, if there's falling demand, if there's bankruptcies, and that's individuals and producers. And I stress this point about producers because Bitcoiners don't see it. They think that the economy would function as normal and that they'll still be able to go out and buy whatever items that they wish to buy. But they're not going to be able to, because the economics of producing those items will be severely impacted with a fixed limit money. It will lead to bankruptcies and mass layoffs. So this is just one graphic example of a deflationary spiral. The point here is that it's a feedback loop, because as PQ begins to reduce, and that is prices and production, then that further increases the purchasing power of the money, which further exacerbates hoarding until there must be some type of mechanism to stop the spiral. So this might be a lot to take in for folks that have never seen this before. So what we'll do is we'll walk through an example of how this would work in a fiat currency system. We'll walk through an example of how it would work in a gold standard economic system, and then we'll look at how it completely collapses in a fixed limit money system. So beginning with a fiat currency system, and Bitcoiners, one of the reasons why they claim that they ignore this is because they claim that it's a Keynesian viewpoint, and there is a bit of truth in that. And Keynesian's one of Keynesian's core theorems is that if there is a deflation, then it's necessary for the government to step in and deficit spend to get the economy out of that deflationary slump. And there is some truth to that, in that, if V starts to drop, the velocity starts to drop, and then PQ has to drop somewhere, either prices or quantity of production. So that can create a spiral, as we've just looked at. Then that can be counteracted by an increase in M, an increase in the money supply. But governments have taken that to an extreme, and Keynes never did advocate for deficit spending year in, year out, i.e. constant deficit spending, such as we see with fiat currency governments today, where they've built up massive sums of debt because they deficit spend every single year. There's no economic theory that would support governments doing that. That's not what Keynes had in mind whenever he wrote about deficit spending. But that's a separate topic. I just mention it here because it's one of the mechanisms of how this equation works. to balance out deflation and inflation as well. If there's inflation, where prices are skyrocketing and velocity is very, very high, well, how can you counteract that? Well, you reduce the money supply, so you clamp down on credit and say, well, interest rates need to be much higher, or some other mechanism where the money supply becomes increasingly tighter to try and rein in that inflation. So it works both ways, this equation. How it worked under a gold standard, where gold was money internationally, and fiat currencies were simply standardized weights and measurements of gold. It was the exact similar type situation where if there was a deflationary period where the velocity dropped and the purchasing power of gold money increased, well, that money supply, there were two mechanisms whereby gold had an elasticity of supply. One is via increased production of gold, so more efforts would be spent on mining gold, of course, because its purchasing power increased, so it made it more economic to go out and mine and take more risks in the capex that's required to get gold out of the ground at a large scale. And there is a secondary aspect of this where in any particular economy, so in the US, for example, if there was a deflationary incident and the prices started to fall because velocity had dropped, well, that means that those goods that were produced in the UK would become more attractive on the international market, and more gold would flow in to the US. So, there were two mechanisms whereby a gold standard balanced inflation and deflation by a natural elasticity of money supply. So hopefully you can see already where problems might begin when M is completely fixed and cannot be adjusted in any way. Where's the mechanism then to stop the deflationary spiral? There is none. Unless you start to look at the PQ side and say, well, government will step in and mandate prices, right? So full price controls, or mandate production. So full communist command and control society with government diktats on prices and production. That's not going to be a nice place to live, folks. The most likely scenario is that the government will say, whose idea was it to have this fixed limit money? Let's sack them and scrap that idea. And that would happen very quickly, folks. And that's one of the reasons why there's never been a fixed limit money, because it's just such a bad idea. The economy would collapse very, very quickly. So it's interesting to hear the arguments from Bitcoiners as to why that wouldn't happen. They don't understand deflation, and that includes folks that hold themselves out as experts like Saifedean, like Lynn Alden. There's a lot of folks that have written books on this topic. They just don't understand deflation. They don't understand how a fixed limit money is impossible, because you lose the necessary elasticity to combat deflation. What we'll do now is examine the common Bitcoiner counter-argument to the issue of fixed limit, because I'm certainly not the first to have pointed this issue out, although I don't think anyone has done as rigorous, extensive deep dive that I have done into why the fixed limit is such a problem. But let's look at the common counter argument, and we seen it briefly in episode 4, where Saifedean had written. Actually, he suggested that the Austrian school had confirmed that if a money is infinitely divisible, then it meets their criteria, which is certainly not the case. There is no reference at all to infinitely divisible money anywhere in any Austrian writing. But that was Saifedean's sentence, if you remember. You can go back to episode 4 and have a look at it again if you choose to do so. But that is the Bitcoiner argument, that Bitcoin is infinitely divisible. Therefore, somehow the fixed limit is irrelevant, and that indeed the money supply is infinite. Therefore, that enables them to argue both sides of the coin, if you like. which is nonsense, of course. It's a fixed limit money, 21 million units. The fact that it is infinitely divisible if you keep adding on zeros. And an analogy to that is having a single slice of bread and saying, I can feed the whole world forever with one slice of bread. Look, I can just keep breaking off smaller and smaller crumbs. You know, the fact that you can break something up into smaller and smaller pieces does not mean that any issues of overall supply. Of course, one slice of bread cannot feed the whole world. That's a supply issue. You know, you cannot solve a supply issue by breaking something up into smaller and smaller pieces. And you can see here that this argument comes from the Satoshi cultists, because Satoshi misunderstood this himself. And you know, he wasn't brave enough to put any of this into the Bitcoin white paper. And if you remember from episode 1, I pointed out that it was very strange that, you know, the design of a new money system, the design of a better money system, would have absolutely no monetary theory in the paper at all. I think there's one sentence in the whole paper where Satoshi just said, "Oh, it'll be inflation proof," and that's not good enough, really. That is enough to be raising concerns and red flags and disacceptance. You know, there's a rejection of the project. That's designed to be money, but has absolutely no argument backing it up in its fundamental paper. You know, we have these various Satoshi posts. So he's issued the white paper. Of course, we covered it in episode 1. The white paper is technically focused on a narrow double spend problem. And then Satoshi's went onto the forums, and the vision has expanded somewhat, which is why I said in episode 1 the project vision was woolly. You know, the white paper said one thing, and Satoshi's posts on the forums say something entirely different. He goes on to say things on the forums that is not covered in the white paper at all, and this is one good example of that. I'm not going to read the whole thing, and the key sentence here is where Satoshi says, if there's massive deflation in the future, the software could show more decimal places. And that is, you know, as I say, the analogy of breaking one slice of bread into smaller and smaller crumbs. Satoshi thinks that is a solution to the deflation problem. And that is simply not the case, because the main issue with deflation, as we've seen in the MVPQ example, it is the hoarding of money because of an expectation of increased purchasing power. That expectation cannot be addressed, resolved, mean reverted. It cannot be satisfied by simply breaking existing units up into smaller and smaller pieces. The lack of an anchor for purchasing power expectations is the main reason why a fixed limit money is impossible. And we'll look at this more closely in the next episode.